Welcome to Science and Wisdom Live, where scientists and meditators meet.
Good evening and welcome everyone to our second Science and Wisdom Live event of the year. It's really good to see so many familiar faces. My name is Marco Colnaghi.
And my name is Saida van der Leeuw.
And we are the project managers of Science and Wisdom Live. And as most of you know by now, Science and Wisdom Live is a young project which aims to explore the middle ground between science and contemplative traditions by bringing together the insights arising from contemplative practice and those arising from the scientific method.
And in that vein, we are very happy to introduce our speaker of tonight, Dr. Marieke van Vugt. I would like to give a short biography. And so Dr. Marieke van Vugt is an assistant professor at the Institute of Artificial Intelligence and Cognitive Engineering, ALICE, of the University of Groningen in the Netherlands. The research in Dr. van Vugt's lab focuses on how, when, and why we mind wander, and what the fundamental cognitive operations are that underlie meditation and mindfulness. Most recently, Marieke started to investigate how analytical meditation practiced by Tibetan monks and nuns affects our cognition and emotion. And she addresses these questions using a combination of computational modeling, neuroscience, and experimental psychology. She very much enjoys projects where science, art, and particularly classical ballet and contemplation meet. And with that, and without further ado, I would like to give the word to Marieke.
Thank you so much for that kind introduction, and thank you so much for having me on this meeting, this virtual meeting. It's really lovely to meet all of you and to see all of you, and I'm looking forward to sharing my work. I hope it will be interesting because I find it fascinating. That's why I do this. So yeah, let me start by sharing my screen with you so I can support the story with some visuals. So this story is entitled Encounters Between Tibetan Monks and Western Scientists, a Study of Analytical Meditation. So the story started in December 2015 when I went to India for, well, I guess the first time in recent times. I had only been there once before as a backpacker. So then I went in my capacity of a scientist and I saw monks debating. Like here you can already see a monk in a debating posture in our lab in the monastery, which is what followed, because I saw these monks debating and I was like, wow, that's really interesting what they're doing. And they're so embodied, passionate, clearly, although I couldn't understand a word of what they were saying, what's going on there. And of course, I have a lot of experience studying mindfulness and other forms of meditation, but this seemed like a whole different kind of contemplative practice. So I wanted to further study it. And this is how this project was born. So today I will share just a couple of little highlights of what analytical meditation is, how I've been studying a particular embodiment of that in monastic debate in Tibetan monks. And yeah, then we'll have a lot of time to chat about it. So this is obviously not just my project. This is a large group of individuals, which includes a substantial number, as you can tell, of so-called science monks at Sarajay. So those are advanced Tibetan monks in the last years of their study who also have an interest in science, and they are collaborating with us in trying to figure out how we can study their practices, the practices they engage in on a daily basis, using scientific methods. And at the same sort of, we are learning from them about their practices, and in exchange we teach them a little bit about the methods of science. So it's a really wonderful cross-cultural collaboration, but obviously also has its challenges, which I will share with you today. So let's start at the beginning. Well, I guess many of these meetings are about contemplative practices and some meditation in some shape or form. And it's helpful to ask, well, what is meditation? And meditation, unfortunately, you could say, at least from a scientist perspective, has many shapes and many definitions, and one would be that it is a method to familiarize your mind with habits that are wholesome. And I think this is an interesting definition. It's not the usual one that we often hear. For those of you who are familiar with mindfulness, where mindfulness is defined as paying attention in a particular way, in the present moment, non-judgmentally. Well, but maybe here this definition goes a bit more to a more ulterior purpose, which is really about transforming your mind and making it more adaptive. And you could also say, in a bigger sense, a method for cultivating wisdom, an embodied wisdom. So this is me as a visiting scholar at Mind and Life Amherst in the time that it was still there, and I was investigating meditation and also trying to build a computerized theory of that. So that's our usual image of what somebody who meditates looks like, but actually it could also look like the picture on the right. So here you have one of the science monks, Calden, debating me about neuroscience and what is the definition of neuroscience. So this is a much more active form of meditation. Interestingly enough, well, I guess you all know this figure. He has been more of a product of the meditation practice on the right, probably, than the one on the left, where the one on the left is sort of what most people think of when they hear the word meditation. So what was he trained in? Well, he was trained in a lot of something like this. So this is a picture of Sarah J Monastery on a regular day, where you see hundreds of monks shouting, stomping, clapping, getting really excited about Buddhist philosophy. And actually, fun story is I've been involved in this research for a while, and I remember one particular day, I'll show you a video in a little bit, where the monks were going all out, and I was asking them afterwards, what were you debating about? And it was, some grammar issue about the past tense, the present tense, and the future tense. And I was like, wow, if my students could get that excited about what they're studying about statistics or neuroscience, that would be quite something. So, I mean, I think clearly something powerful is going on here. So what is it? So what I've learned over the years is there's a practice of analytical meditation, and this is using logic and reasoning to contemplate. So whereas a lot of the stereotypes around meditation are like, well, it's, you're just sitting there quiet and you're trying not to have any judgments. Well, these are practices that actually do involve judgments, and very critical and sharp and precise judgments. Another way to really investigate the nature of self and the nature of reality. So just a fun practice that we can actually maybe do together a little bit. So imagine, well, maybe take a moment and you can just sort of turn your mind inwards, listen to my voice, and maybe join me in the thought process. So first you would start by probably relaxing a bit so that your mind is not too busy. And then, think back to a situation that probably many of you might have found yourself in. This, you're in traffic and this person has just cut you off in traffic. And then the thought arises, this person is really nasty. Probably, because he cut me off in traffic, or she. So now think about this. How do we actually arrive at that feeling? That very vivid feeling that this is really a nasty person, and we're gonna, honk at them, shout at them. They're nasty. So basically, what gives rise to these thoughts? Probably it's just some kind of a habit that says whoever cuts me off in traffic is really nasty. Is that true? And actually, what does it mean to be nasty? Is nasty a permanent characteristic? Is this person always nasty? Or maybe were they going to the hospital where, their wife was in labor? Or maybe they were in fact nasty because they just had a fight with their partner. But then tomorrow, they might be, caring with the greatest care for their child. And then you can drop the reasoning and just hang out in the feeling for a little bit. So this would be an example of how you can really use your mind and your logic to contemplate the nature of a situation. Of course, the monks often would be studying, as far as I've learned, understood, more, very profound Buddhist texts, but even, thinking about simple daily life situations, thinking about it in a much broader perspective can be really very powerful, and doing it in a meditative way can really help to change your mental patterns. So that's analytical meditation. And what's interesting is that, thinking about things in a meditative way in a monastery, there would be this solitary action, as far as I've understood. But there is also a dyadic version or a group version, which is in a way an extension of this, where your partner would actually help you to contemplate something, because it's not always easy to see something from many different angles, but another person can easily help you. Moreover, what the monks are engaging here in this practice also involves a very clear and specific logical structure, which helps to make sure that the reasoning is valid. So in this monastic debate practice that I'm going to talk to you about tonight is really one that has a very specific logical structure, where the challenger or the questioner, the one who is standing here, helps the defender to find inconsistencies in his or her position. So the position in the previous example would be, this person who cut me off in traffic is nasty. And then you can investigate, like, what is the evidence in favor of that position, and how is that consistent with other beliefs I have? I mean, it presupposes that the assumption really that whoever is cutting me off in traffic is nasty, and then you already start to see quite soon that this is a problematic assumption and not quite in line with other stuff we know about the world. So this other person can really help you to find out, you know, what's not logical about this position. And then you'll find out that pretty much anything can be illogical when you really think about it. The other interesting thing about this practice is that it has a very impressive physical manifestation that involves clapping, stomping, shouting, but also a lot of laughing. It is actually, as far as I've observed and also practiced, quite a joyful practice as well. So let's actually have a look at what this looks like in the lab. Oh, and I'm gonna do a little trick here. Because oh yeah, it's gonna work. Just wanted to check that the sound was gonna be cool. So what we're seeing here is we've transported ourselves to India, to Sarajay Monastery Science Center. So you can see lovely science posters on the wall. And here are two of my willing victims who are wearing EEG caps. So their brainwaves are going to be measured and they're going to be debating. So the gentleman on the right, he is the challenger, the questioner, and he is going to debate the one on the left on their position. And next to me is, so here I'm sitting, and next to me is another monk who is helping me identify interesting moments in the debate that we can further investigate with brainwaves. So let's have a look. 3, 2, 1.
Ja, da zoom dus dat de wat die kan zo. Ja, as. Oh, 토마토 많이 비싸. 토마토 이게 와. 토마토 많이 받아. 사와티 예스. 야, 토마토 주시면 비싸. 야스. 캐스타. 네, 가서라. 야스. 이거 나가서 들어. 어예. 나한테 토마토 주시면 돼요. 토마토 주시면.
So you can tell this is still quite leisurely. So where's the stomping and shouting? Well, let's find some moments. Okay, yeah, so I could watch this forever. It's really a lot of fun, you can tell, even though I have no clue about what they're saying. So what are they really doing? Well, so they typically start a debate by invoking the deity of wisdom, Manjushri. I actually didn't put that on the slide, but then the more formal part is then the challenger is determining the topic. So they're in power of what is going to be debated. But obviously, usually this would be whatever they're studying at that moment. Then they would jointly recite relevant sections of text. They would recall the outline. They would recall definitions, like if I'm debating about neuroscience, the challenger might ask me, so what's your definition of neuroscience and which subdivisions are there of neuroscience, cognitive neuroscience, behavioral neuroscience, cellular neuroscience, and then what's the definition of cellular neuroscience and so on. And that's called also counting debate. And then they're going through repeated cycles of the challenger making statements of the shape, the form like blah blah blah. It follows that something. So they're basically making an assertion. So take the subject, the person who cut me off in traffic. It follows that they're nasty. And then the defender might say either I accept that position, or they might say why, in which case they wouldn't accept it. And at that point, the challenger can make a different kind of statement, can move on, or they can actually give a reason. And if the challenger gives a reason, then the defender has two answer options, either saying that the reason is not valid or there's no logical pervasion. So I'm not going to go into the complexities of this, but basically these are the rules of debate in its simplest form. And well, there's you can learn all kinds of tips and tricks, but basically this is the fundamentals. And so what the trick is that the challenger can say whatever they want. The defender, whatever they're agreeing to, so whatever they accept, has to be consistent with each other. So obviously what the challenger is going to do is they're going to try to get to an inconsistency. And they basically keep going until the defender contradicts themselves, at which point they make this movement called sa. Basically, it's something, I think, translated as something like you're finished or strike. This is a bit of a game, obviously, to try to get to these contradictions, but it's also very illuminating because it makes you think at, well, what is consistent with this particular position? So let's actually do another fun example interaction, one that I've cooked up that's totally not realistic for what the monks probably would be talking about. So this one is actually freely following a nice video by Tibetan children. So take the subject you, it follows that you're stupid. And they would make this clapping movement. And then the defender might ask why. So basically they don't agree. And then the challenger might say, well, because you failed the test. Then the defender says, well, okay, yeah, well, I guess they failed the test. I accept. So then the challenger might say, well, take the subject Einstein. It follows he is stupid. Why? Because he did the test. So you can start to realize, and then, you know, they could follow up with saying something like, well, and anyone who did the test, who failed the test, oh, sorry, I should have said who failed the test. But anyone who failed the test is stupid because, well, even obviously Einstein would sometimes fail tests. So they would work their way up to proving a contradiction in this kind of an assertion. So this is a little bit of the intuition of what they would be doing. So yeah. So how can we study this scientifically? So that happened in collaboration with Sarah J. Monastic University, which you also can see here, the main hall. We had many discussions with the science monks of Sarah J. And later also the partner monastery, Sarah May. And we jointly developed some hypotheses and experiments, which included EEG recorded during the debate, in which we asked quite a few questions. The one I will talk about today is there evidence of sort of the debate practices, or maybe just the general monastic education being a kind of attention training? The other thing we investigated were cognitive tasks of the one similar to the ones we're using in the West. Turns out that that's really complicated, so I'm not going to talk about it today. We can discuss about it. And finally, we're using self-report questionnaires in which we look at how the monks report on their emotions. And I will give you some very, very pilot data today that I was just analyzing today. So I thought it would be really fun to, to talk about that, but don't take it too seriously. So yeah. We already saw a variant of this picture. We collected a lot of data from many, many monks who were wearing these fun EEG caps, wires coming out of their heads, going into a backpack while they were being videoed. And we're looking at what's going on in their brains when they're debating. And one of the things we wanted to investigate was attention. So we know in general that attention is associated with increases in brain waves in frontal midline. There's also called frontal midline theta. So theta is an oscillation, a periodic brain wave from 4 to 9 hertz. And for example, advanced meditators have been shown to show an increase in this frontal midline theta. So we thought, well, maybe that also happens when monks debate, and especially as the debate continues, because they told us, like, when we're debating initially we might be quite distracted, especially when, you know, you're in a lab wearing a backpack, wires coming out of your head. You can imagine this is quite challenging. But then as they continued to debate, they would forget everything around them, and in particular the most skilled debaters, they reported, would completely not see anything when they're really in the zone. So we wanted to see whether there was evidence for this from brain activity. So we recorded EEG with a 32 channel system. We used active electrodes. So those of you who know anything about EEG might be like, yeah, how is that going to work? Because these monks are moving, dancing, stomping. Well, so the nice thing is that we used electrodes that have amplification inside, so that they are less sensitive to movement, and that normally causes a lot of noise in the recordings. And then we did lots of stuff, technical stuff. We basically proved that there was no difference between the challengers that moved a lot and the defenders that moved very little in the kind of EEG that you normally see that reflects muscle activities, which you would expect to be higher if there is really a problem with noise. And then we measured, like, to what extent the brains of the two debaters were in sync with each other, but also we looked at how there were moments of synchrony, or moments of focus and distraction identified by monks. But today I'm actually gonna leave all of that complication. I'm just gonna focus on, is there an increase in this frontal midline theta that again might reflect this kind of a focus absorption over the course of the debate? And would this be stronger for the more experienced monks than for more beginners that have only like 6 years of experience? So we're comparing about 6 years of experience to 15 years of experience. So here is our first study that we did. So this is the time in the debate. It starts at time 0, and then they were debating for somewhere between 8 and 20 minutes or so. And on the y-axis, you can see the magnitude of these brain waves in the frontal midline, like here in the front. So I've also drawn it here in this picture. So you can see that overall, these theta waves really go up quite dramatically. In red, you see the beginners. In blue, you see the more experienced monks. And you can see that the experienced monks go up in total much more than the beginners, although they start up a little higher. But this is just, you know, where the baseline is, and that's kind of not really meaning anything, because we sort of compare that to right before the recording starts. So it's, yeah. And at this moment, there shouldn't be that much of a difference. So, well, in the first experiment, there were some hints, but there was this funny going down, and, you know, it was a quite uncontrolled situation because we had no idea what we were doing. So we didn't kind of standardize. So in the second study, second experiment, we kind of replicated it, but made every group of monks debate for exactly the same amount of time, namely 15 minutes, about the same topic with, and so the only thing that differed was whether they were beginner or experienced monks. And now you can see much, much more clearly that the experienced monks really go up a lot in their frontal theta, whereas the beginners don't go up that much. Interestingly enough, we now also compared the counting debate. So that's the kind of debate they do in the beginning, where they ask for definitions, ask for subdivisions, and looked at this theta effect. And we found that overall it went up much less for both beginners and experienced monks than during the logic debate, which also the monks felt was much more engaging, much more what you needed to concentrate on. So that was kind of nice. And the final thing was that we also looked at kids that had just learned to debate in their school. So these are children in a Tibetan children's village. And they learn some of these debate techniques, and then, you know, debate about the periodic table or about rational numbers. It's really, really cute. And we actually didn't see any increase in frontal midline theta for the kids, because obviously they have very, very little experience, only a few hours really. So So it's kind of interesting that it does seem like this monastic debate practice really hones this ability to really focus on something. And it makes a lot of sense too, because obviously when you're debating, you shouldn't forget what you've said and what your partner has said, and you have to keep track of all these different lines of reasoning. So it does require quite some mental focus. And, you know, I've been learning a little bit to debate, and I can really attest to that. I mean, I've had to resort to writing things on paper, but obviously that's not what monks can do during a real debate. So yeah, that's one way that we've tried to tackle studying the effects of debate, in this case on the brain. Another thing that's really interesting to study is emotion. So here you can see a monk sort of looking up to their challenger, and you know, it's quite intimidating when somebody is shouting at you and clapping and stomping. So you can imagine this would involve quite a bit of emotion regulation. And in fact, at multiple moments, the monks have mentioned to us that really it seems like the monastic training, and of course we don't know whether that's debate or any other aspect of living in the monastery, really seems to help with emotion regulation. So they would say that, you know, the monks, when they come in, they might be quite angry, but then over the years they become much more peaceful. And I would also say that's really what it feels like when you visit the monastery as a visitor there. So most of the monks are so incredibly kind and humorous and playful and peaceful. So it's, yeah, very something you really notice. So we were wondering, how can we measure this? Well, what we do in the West when we try to measure these is usually self-report. So we ask people, how happy do you feel? How sad do you feel? How angry do you feel? So, you know, since this is the state of the art, more or less, we figured, let's try this. This is not without problems, because we spent hours trying to translate, especially some of the emotion words. You have to really think about how are the monks gonna react? Are they going to really honestly report on their emotions, or are they gonna try to please the experimenter and say what they want to hear? That's always a big problem. And one interesting thing we found also in this process is that Western emotions seem to be classified in positive and negative based on hedonic tone. In Tibetan monks, when they were talking about positive and negative emotions, it seemed to be a much more morally driven division between positive and negative emotions. So there's really quite a bit of interesting differences there to explore. So today I'm just going to give you some very, very preliminary results on the basis of some data I've collected together with the monks over the years so far. So one of the things we did was use a standardized a questionnaire of difficulties in emotion regulation. And one thing that was very clear is that when you compare novices to more senior monks, there are very clear differences, very clear decrease in the difficulties of regulating emotions. So this was still based on a fairly small sample, but it's quite a big effect. So we definitely want to follow up on this and see whether we can replicate it, but it's interesting. The other thing that's interesting is a pilot in 76 monks, where we just wanted to check, you know, if we ask monks over a period of a couple of days, multiple times a day, to report their emotions, how reliable are those actually? So one way that you can look at this is just to ask about an emotion, or well, about something that you know the right answer. So for example, we use tiredness here and self-reports of tiredness over the days. And you can see there's some nice fluctuations here where pretty standardly they report feeling more tired in the evening. So, you know, at least they're taking the questions quite seriously, because you see this expected pattern of a lot of tiredness in the evening and not as much tiredness in the morning, and especially at the start of the lesson. Yay! This was in the Emory Tibet Science Initiative that we did these experiments. Now, interestingly enough, then when asked about positive affect, we found that it was incredibly constant. So I still have to compare this to what we see in what we would see in a Western sample. And of course, there's going to be tremendous amounts of confounds, but I found this quite striking, is that they really were very, very consistent in their positive emotions. Then we recently collected some data during COVID-19 in the monastery, and these are some interesting, very, very preliminary results. So here we're looking at data for less experienced monks compared to more experienced monks. But I mean, most of the monks in our sample have at least 5 years of being there. They've already been a monk for 5 years. So this is just how long have they been a monk. That's, you know, the reliable data that we have so far. And then we asked them, amongst other things, about how peaceful they felt, how happy they felt, how content they felt, and how inspired they felt. And this was literally at the end of January, beginning of February, right before Tibetan New Year. Now, interestingly enough, quite consistently, the more experienced monks in blue tend to report feeling more peaceful, more happy, a bit more content, and more inspired than the monks with who are those individuals who have fewer years that they've been a monk, which I think the median years of being a monk in our sample was 23. So they already been monks for quite a while, but you could tell that those with less than 23 years and more than 23 years of experience, they were quite, there were some interesting differences. So yeah, maybe there is something there, even with our course methods of questionnaires, self-report data, there is something there that we can study. And of course, again, there are so many factors in the monastic education that could drive any differences in emotion regulation. But I wouldn't be surprised if analytical meditation and debate, which accounts for a large part of what the monks are doing, is really helping the monks to regulate their emotions, including during COVID-19. So what we also want to do is repeat the same study, ideally with some of the same individuals, once COVID is over, maybe a year from now, who knows, fingers crossed. So yeah, so finally, to finish off my talk, it's probably interesting to also later discuss some reflections on the methods. So all of this is data collection in a very complex real-life situation of a Tibetan monastery, and that's not at all like the lab where I usually collect my data, where you get university students who all have the same level of education come in and do your task, very familiar with computers and so on. In a monastery, on the other hand, you have all kinds of individuals, some of whom who have just migrated there from Tibet and who are kind of nomads who have not had any education before, and as well as other monks who have been in Indian high schools and gotten normal, sort of, well, normal, a Western style education that are much more familiar with these ways of thinking. But then there's also not so controlled conditions, people walking in. I mean, I think at some point we had a minister of education of the Tibetan government sort of walk in, or a seminar, cows, dogs, all of those things. This was like a pet squirrel that one of our participants brought along onto the study. It's also a challenge because we didn't want the monks just to be guinea pigs. We really wanted to learn together. So that means it's really a slow science. It's not gonna give quick results because everything is a learning process for everyone involved, but it's very worthwhile. And it's then extra gratifying when you see one of your monks, this is Kalden, actually presenting some of our research on a meditation research conference in India. He's now actually studying at Emory University, so it's really, really cool. So yeah, it's a challenging project. And of course, probably the most profound effects of these practices are on much less tangible things, like wisdom, or even, you know, the emotion measures that we have are very, very coarse. And I don't know whether we will be able to find good measures of the things that are really being cultivated by these practices. But, you know, that's a nice challenge. So overall, it seems like monastic debate helps to cultivate attention. We have some evidence for this, but maybe on a much more casual observer level, it really helps to bring philosophy alive. And here you can actually see one of my colleagues who was together with me learning to debate also in the Science Center ourselves. And I can really tell you that it is great fun. We also actually held an online debate winter school a few weeks ago where we rebuilt the monastery in a virtual environment, and with like, I don't know, I think we had more than 100 people signed up, like about 20 to 30 active participants debating online in a virtual monastery, and everybody had great fun. So I think there's something to that too, the first person experience. And then, there's we do seem to find some effects on emotion regulation, and maybe it's exactly because this practice is so confrontational, where monks are really well, seemingly very emotional. They're shouting at each other, and maybe that's exactly why it helps to cultivate emotion regulation, on top of course the actual Buddhist philosophy that they're debating, which might also help from a more reasoning perspective to regulate emotions, like in the example I gave about the nasty person who was cutting us off in traffic. And so I think overall, some very preliminary conclusions, mostly at this point still based on my own first-person experience, is that bringing in reasoning is a very powerful way to transform our minds. And so now I have time for questions. And before we do that, just want to acknowledge some of the funders of this work. So obviously that's really important too. So thank you so much. And I will go back to the summary slides for your reference.